Hello and welcome, everyone. What a big day we have in terms of RBA, one of the most anticipated days for many months, almost a couple of years. Evan, welcome, everyone. Evan.
I'm ready to lose my $50.
You're ready to lose your $50. Look, it is going to be a big show, and obviously we've started around that sort of 20 minutes before the RBA gives us their announcement. But I just want to run through how we're going to break down the show today. We're talking about this cash rate call is so big, so we're going to make a case for a hold, and we're also going to make a case for the cut, and that will lead us in to 2:30, of which we will then get the announcement as well.
Yep.
And then we're going to sort of talk to the Australian data in terms of what to look for next, right? In other words, one cut does not make, what's that saying? One swallow does not make a spring or a summer. The same rules apply here. Obviously, it's still in restrictive settings, so we're going to be making sure that we can give you the idea of the data you need to be looking at in terms of where rates are going to go from there. Then part three, really, in terms of we're going to open our eyes. Normally we start with the US, and this really is the biggest global story going around. And this is Trump, President Donald Trump's big US economic experiment.
That's one way of putting it.
It is one way of putting it. So we're going to unpack the strategy, what he's trying to achieve by doing it, and what are the challenges he faces in terms of getting this redirection and rebirth of the US going forward. And then finally, we'll wrap up with China and the Eurozone, because whatever Donald Trump does and the biggest economy in the world does, that will have ramifications on both of those markets. So we'll talk to that. So we have a massive show ahead for you, and we appreciate your time in terms of watching along at home. So let's get into the Australian market. Now, as I said earlier, it's 2:30. That's the D time. That's the time that we're counting down to. So we're going to be talking to effectively the pros and the cons in terms of what's happening. How long has it been since we last caught up?
2.5 months, and I have deliberately nicked off with Ben's highlighters because I want to go through what has happened in those 2.5 months from when you and I last stood here talking about all this kind of stuff and where we find ourselves today. As I said, I expect to lose my $50, despite the fact that I'm about to stand up and be devil's advocate and talk about
doing a good job.
The hold, because I've got the highlighter out for a fairly decent reason. I know you can't see it too much on there, but this is the statement from December, and the two big headlines: underlying inflation remains too high. We can't have inflation at 3.5% when the midpoint is 2.5%, and the outlook remains uncertain. That is what was on the December numbers, and why Ben and I have gone the other way around. Why we are going to sit here and talk to you about what is going to happen in the next 15 minutes when we actually get the release.
Yep.
As I said, I know I'm going to be wrong.
Well, you may be right. Like, put the case forward. So we're going to put the case forward for why rates won't lift today.
Yep.
It's still coming, but it just may not be this month. So let's have a look at this headline and trimmed mean inflation story.
So the economic person inside me, the person that has been listening to the gatekeepers, the RBA, for the last 2.5 years, Ben, since this all started, is around the whole idea that our purchasing power is being eroded by inflation being too high, that the lower socioeconomic cohort feels this the most acutely, and if their ability to purchase things keeps diminishing, that we will actually have a crisis in society. That's not an exaggeration. That's what they are saying is why inflation is their number one headache and what keeps them up at night. So the chart on screen is to show you the band that the RBA has, 2 to 3%, to allow inflation to run there, and where the headline figure, which is what all of the politicians at the moment are telling you, which is at 2.4%, and then the trim mean, which is the core, taking out the top 15 and bottom 15%, is sitting at. I'm going to talk about that the most. That 3.2% compound interest, something that Einstein is credited with saying is the eighth wonder of the world, at 3.2% running year on year. Because this is what's also missed in this debate. This isn't that prices are going down. This is that the rate of change is slowing. Prices are still increasing at 3.2%. That's the debate.
And what happens when prices increase by that? Our living standards and our purchasing power diminish.
Correct.
So the example that you use, $10 today is going to be worth how much in the future value terms?
Yeah, so if we allow 3.2% to run up $10, so that's a good way of using it, in 3 years' time, your $10, you're going to need just shy of 30.
Yep.
Right? So if it's to run at 2, it's about $11.50, almost $12.
Yep.
Okay, so it doesn't sound like much, but that $1 difference, when you add another zero onto the back of that,
extrapolate multiple zeros,
or your home loan, for example, in terms of what that sits at, that's the concern. And that's what the RBA has been saying over and over and over again, which brings me to 4 charts that I've been also banging on about with you guys for the last sort of periods. So let's have a look at it another way. Let's take just core. Whether you look at trim mean or whether you look at weighted mean, you can see they're outside the band. And that's the band that the RBA looks at. Yes, the rate of change is declining, but then the chart on the right is, for me, the killer, right? If you take food and energy out of the last numbers, you can see that overall, everything else is running at 3.6, not 3.2, 3.6. Now, people will come to you and say, don't forget, this is a rolling 12-month thing. And if you look at the first quarter of calendar year 24, there were some really high numbers and they'll roll off and there'll be a massive drop.
The base effect is often what we talk about. Yep.
Get that. But again, what that is showing you is that services are still well and truly firing.
Yep.
That we still have more demand in the economy than we're supplying. And then if we look at what the next one comes to, the other thing that I keep going to you about are these two. Sticky inflation, service inflation, inflation that's the hairdresser, that's the dentist, the ones that try and basically hold on and hold on and hold on before they pass on any additional costs to you, 4 months or more, still running at 4%. But the one that caught my attention the most from the December figures is that life admin. And this is something I know, Ben, you know this very well, and you guys out there in property land know this incredibly well. It went from growing at 5.4% to 0.45% in that change. Now, that is because we saw a rapid increase in government handouts.
Yes.
That have now come through year on year.
Rebates.
Handouts.
Cash.
And that's why I've got in there. So it's rent, property, utilities, automotive, fuel, all the stuff that you have to do to basically, live a normal life. That drop-off is why we've seen such a massive drop-off in the inflation figure. Does the RBA in 10 minutes' time look through it? That's my no case to say, yes, inflation's coming the right way, but it is still too high. It is still not at a level that makes us sustainably back to target, and the impact that it's having on the lower socioeconomic group, we cannot, therefore, in good conscience, cut rates today.
It's almost like a debate, isn't it? It's great. So the sticky inflation over here is obviously something we'll unpack now. So let's have a look at the inflation data as we saw it roll out. So it was a good read. It was a very, very good print in terms of what we saw in January. So the annual inflation fell to 2.4% in Q4 from last year's 2.8%. Okay, now that's because it had been manipulated by government electrical rebates.
Go on, read through your numbers.
Handouts. And it was the lowest reading since Q1 of 2021. But again, manufactured. So let's have a look underneath the bonnet. Goods inflation sharply eased. So this continues to be this story, right? So we had a 0.8 of 1% versus 1.4 from Q3. Off the back of the electricity, ready? Negative 25.2 versus negative 15.8. That is deflationary. But
it's not just that. It also means our taxes are paying to subsidize our energy. It's just insane in terms of where it sits. Like the RBA has said that basically we are subsidizing now for the future.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing. And anyway, you keep going.
That's right. We also saw fuel. So obviously that's world demand, and that was off the back of the tariffs, which we'll get to later in terms of there's a common belief economically, globally, that tariffs are restrictive in economic growth and economic activity. So we saw petrol prices come down. And so we saw, yes, negative 7.5 in Q4 versus negative 6.2. So we like the fact that our fuel's a little bit cheaper when we're putting fuel in the car, but that's also part of that particular story. Now, here we go, services inflation. There is some good news in the service inflation. So service inflation hit a 3-quarter low of 4.3% versus 4.6, but it's still 4.3%.
Yep.
To Evan's point, right?
Are we happy with that, are we?
No, we're not. Prices eased for food, 3% versus 3.3. Evan just showed us that before. Alcohol and tobacco, still 6.2% versus 6.7. But alcohol and tobacco way outside of that inflationary target that we're trying to get down to. Clothing only 1.3%, so within target band versus 1.7. Housing was 1% versus 2.8. Health was 4%, so still outside the band versus 4.8. And insurance and financial services, which is absolutely a killer at the moment, we've seen 5.4% versus 6.1%. So this cost of insurance with all of our climate events and so forth that have been going on.
Not just here, overseas as well.
Correct.
Look at the LA
it's right through the whole world in terms of what's going on. But we're seeing insurances tick up considerably, like from 15 to 25% increases in a 12-month period. And that's off the back of double-digit growth the year before. So we don't think that that's going to slow down. So that is problematic. Okay, now in contrast, we saw a cost acceleration in recreation, 3.3% versus 2.1%. Education, 6.5% versus 6.4%, and housing services, household services, 1.5% versus 0.7%. So on the whole, I did this intentionally where I did sort of from 2020 up to 2024. So we can see the journey that we've been on. Okay, so if we just cast our minds all the way back, we had supply shocks, and that obviously led to delays. We had stimulus in all government areas. Everyone was paid even though they weren't working. Everyone got all this money. We went on spending sprees because we had nothing else to do. We weren't allowed out of our homes. And so we had this absolutely big supply chain shock. And that was the first stage of that inflation journey up to 7.8. And then off the back of that, that was the goods inflation. And then the services inflation followed as a sort of trailing inflation. And the service inflation is what everyone was saying is the sticky inflation.
Yep.
And so that's exactly why that's been holding there. So then we go and have a look at the trimmed mean. Okay, so in terms of the trim mean, we can see here that that is, again, moving in the right direction. It takes out those more volatile items that Evan was talking about before, the top 15% below, lower 15%. So we get a better weighted reading in the middle. Okay, and we've seen that that has also rose 3.2% year on year, and that's the slowest gain in 3 years. So the RBA would be looking at this and saying, this takes a long time to show up. So they'd be thinking about that in terms of, these sort of levers that they pull. It takes a long time to turn the ship around. And so they're potentially thinking that the ship is turned around and we're sailing into a better inflationary story in terms of what we've seen before. And then when you...
Sorry, I was going to say, the other thing of why the RBA today will tell you that they're probably going to cut rates, this is all rearview mirror. This is all retrospective data.
Correct. Yeah.
This is to the 31st of December, that if you look at all that material, it's happened, and the momentum, and that's the term they'll use, the momentum in price growth is now moderating at a rate that we think is getting back to a sustainable level. Back to a sustainable. It's not there yet, but back to.
I have no doubt that there will be a question in Governor Bullock's press conference where there will be asked, why did you move when inflation doesn't look to be sustainably in that 2 to 3 bandwidth? And
or even when we're not even in it. Right, so that'll be the question. Why are we moving when we're not in it?
Well, yes, true, in trim mean terms, which is their preferred measure. That's right. But I believe she'll bring up the argument that in the last 6 months, we've seen it fall inside that band. So over the last 6 months, the trim mean has fallen to 2.7. And so there will be some aspects of that. So that is one of the things. Now, what we've also seen over the course of all of these holds, which has been frustrating many consumers and certainly mortgage holders, is this story around that the RBA knows that it does take time to turn the ship. And so ultimately they are thinking probably medium to longer term. And obviously they know it's going to take time for this to flow through economically into the broader economic aspects of it.
The rule of thumb is 6 months. So the
Yep.
rule of thumb is what happens today impacts in 6 months' time. So
Yep.
you're not going to start to see the re-acceleration that we're talking about until probably July.
Yep.
Now, there is other factors in 2025. We've got a federal election coming
Yes.
up sometime in the next 2.5 months. So that will also be there. But overall, if it's going to wait to July to get this one to filter in, it's why the expectation is, and even with my no explanation, there will be more this year. It's just a question of when that will be the case. So this comes through in July in terms of it showing up in the data. Then therefore, September, November, December becomes much, much more live for more cuts.
Right. So we've got about 3 minutes before the RBA makes the announcement. But I also want to talk about a couple of other things. Governor Bullock has also expressed that she understands people are hurting. She's read those letters in terms of what's happening. And she made the commitment, as I'm sure the board will also be pleased if they are cutting rates today, that they don't want to hold rates at this restrictive level for as long, for any longer than they have to.
Yep.
So that is potentially easing the brake. It's not going to open the floodgates, as we know. And to their credit, I'm also going to give the RBA credit. I'm a big fan of the RBA more generally anyway, but the dual mandate is also full employment. And so this narrow path that we've been talking about for almost
years,
but about 18 months, I would say that narrative came about, is being able to hold on to that higher levels of employment. Now, I will argue, because I'm politically active, that a lot of the reason why we've held on to those employment levels has been the government spending and the government jobs, which you could also argue is the reason why rates stayed higher for longer.
Yep. But it's also helped the economy.
It has. These blunt instruments can cause, we talk about that economic flywheel, they can absolutely cause a lot more pain, and it takes a lot longer to start. So there's pros and cons to that. And I think the last one, we've got a minute and a half to go, probably 2 minutes, is that if they don't cut rates, right, there is something that's happening at the board level, which is an interesting angle to look at this.
Your angles.
And that is, Elise Ellis, the chief economist who also worked at the RBA for many, many years, 27 years or so, also mentioned, she's now the chief economist of Westpac, she mentioned this in one of her adjustments. So remember, she moved her rate cut to May and then brought it back into February. And she did say one thing that's really interesting that's happening is there is a change of the board structure come the April meeting. And that means that there are 2 new members coming in, 2 leaving the RBA board. Thank you for your service, by the way. But imagine if
they're just maybe across the government's board rather than being in the rate board.
That's true, but they are appointed by the treasurer, obviously Dr. Jim Chalmers. So there's a political risk there in terms of the independence of the board if these 2 members come in and all of a sudden there's a rate cut.
So you need to understand that the 2 members that are coming in are some of the most respected members.
Of course, but you can see the political angle that could happen there. So if they go today,
my personal point of view, the 2 appointees are absolutely fantastic appointees because they are monetary policy boffins. They both worked overseas.
Yeah, they're good appointments.
McKibben was at the Bank of Canada. Anyway, I get your point, and I understand. Not only that, the April one, there isn't any additional data that comes in April.
Well, guess what? We've ticked to that time, so let's have a quick look.
5 seconds to go.
And see what we've got. I've got that time on my diary here, so let me see if I can get to that. Here we go.
Refreshing.
Let's hit the refresh. And are we going to get a read?
Come on. Everybody's going to be doing this today.
Yeah, everyone. So it's probably, yes.
We have a rate cut.
Okay, so we got the rate cut. It's 0.25. We didn't get the 0.35. We even didn't get to talk about that prior.
This makes no sense anymore. So
I'll tear it up.
I'll throw that on the floor. Let's go on. Come on, let's go and have a look at it.
All right, here we go. So we're going to go into the monetary policy statement. And what do we learn in terms of underlying inflation is moderating?
So it's no longer, as it said before, remaining too high.
What do we say?
Too high. So in the December quarter, inflation was 3.2%, which suggests inflationary pressures are easing a little more quickly than expected. Okay. There has been continued subdued growth in private demand. Now,
where's
that
my
is,
$50?
Yeah, it's in my pocket. I'll get it out. I'll double or nothing on that one when the next one
Yeah, we'll do that.
These factors give the board more confidence that inflation is moving sustainably back to the midpoint of okay.
Yeah.
upside risk remains. This is what we're going to talk about probably after this around the global issues
that
come with
now.
this and coming off to it. And outlook remains uncertain. So here's the new statement that Ben's just been handed by our brilliant production team. I want to go through a few other things that are on there catching my attention. Growth output is weak. Right. So that is what Ben was talking about before. The handbrake
justification
is there. They need to release it. We cannot keep it for any longer. Private domestic demand is recovering a little more slowly, and that's probably fair than earlier expected. And there is an uncertainty around the extent to which the recovery in the household spending in late 24 will persist. So again, that was part of what I was also pointing to that I was slightly concerned about, is that in October, November, during, you had all the new Black Friday, Cyber Monday sales, those kinds of things, the household started to spend again and started to spend probably above trend in terms of where we saw. What they're saying is it's transitory. It's not actually a structural change. We'll wait and see. And I think that's also part of what it is. I love the next one. I know this has been something of yours, which is wage pressure has eased a little more than expected. Now, that's true, but wages are still technically growing at the fastest rate they are in 12 years. So again, push-pull on where this sits. And a lot of that wage price pressure is coming from the public sector, not from the private sector. How sustainable will that be in terms of where we sit? That will be the questions that we now need to look at with regards to where that sits. Moving through it, again, this is the bit. The sustainably returning to inflation to target is the priority. So yes. What is sustainable? I
think what we're seeing in this statement really is also some narrative around this idea that don't expect the floodgates to open. So they will ultimately be data-driven in terms of some further easing that they may do, because there's a case in here in terms of for at least one more cut, consumption slower than expected, resulting in continued subdued growth outlooks. Uncertainty around the outlook also remains significant. So geopolitical and policy uncertainties.
So second to last statement, I think, is the most telling one. Forecast published today suggests that if monetary policy is easing too much too soon, disinflation, which is obviously inflation that's falling, could stall, and inflation would settle above the midpoint of the target range. In removing a little of the policy restrictiveness, in today's decision, the board acknowledges that progress has been made, but is cautious about the outlook. So that is why the double or nothing bet will be, when is the next one?
Yes.
And by how much?
All right. So by the end of the show, we'll give you our predictions on what that would look like. But yeah, I think we've done that. So congratulations. Look, what does it mean in terms of, let's sort of go to, the sort of monetary outcome in terms of what that looks like. So a rate cut of this size, if you just do it in very simple terms, for every $100,000 in borrowings, that's an annual saving of around $250. Okay, so if you then think about a $500,000 mortgage, that's around $1,250 in annual savings, or just over $104 a month as part of that. Now, this is the first cut since November of, I'm trying to remember the year, 2012. Thank you. 2020, my bad. Sorry, it's the first cut since 2020. I was missing my cue there. Where we did get a 0.15 cut, which took our cash rate down to 0.1 of 1%.
That was the other question that some of us were debating, was today the day they got rid of this 0.1 annoyance?
Yes.
Now, machines can calculate it, no problems at all, but there is sort of that anal retentiveness that economists have. They're like, can we get rid of this 0.1 issue that's been in place since the 20...
So 13 rate increases since then. I'll get my numbers right in a moment. Totaling 4.25, and obviously we've now come back to that. So the great debate will still be, where is the sort of neutral point? There's a lot of conversations around that neutral point being a cash rate of around 3 to 3.5%. But I can see some other economists saying maybe it's a little bit higher, and then some are saying it's a little bit lower. But I think if you're working in that bandwidth, I reckon you're about right especially when you've got full employment. I think that employment one does, entice potentially pressures on wages, pressures on.
And you can see also in the behaviour that we saw in October through December, that even if this rate cutting cycle is shallower than history, we're actually going to feel it more acutely because we have bigger borrowings than we've ever had before. So, taking 0.75 of 1%, which is the median estimate of economists for this calendar year of what will happen, we will feel that much more acutely than we ever have before in terms of the pressure off the household budget. Because as Ben has just pointed out, if you take that up, I mean, the rule of thumb is it's basically, $250 per 100K.
Yep.
So if you go up to 0.75, you're talking about 750 per month. That
starts to matter. Yep. It starts to inject more
let alone
money.
if you live in the East Coast, where more likely your average mortgage is going to be probably towards 700, maybe even much as $750,000.
Yep.
It gets bigger again.
Cool. All right. So let's have a look at the employment/unemployment data. And so, because this is one of the key indicators that we're going to be looking towards in terms of it's going to inform our predictions, but also inform the RBA in terms of the ultimate decision that they make. So, again, credit to them in terms of, treading that narrow path to the outcome that they've got to so far. But as you say, it still remains uncertain in terms of exactly where the inflation level will sit, and they absolutely are determined to get it to that 2 to 3% bandwidth. So what do we see? Australia's seasonally adjusted unemployment rate inched higher. So this is the December number. The January number comes out in a couple of days on the 20th.
Of course.
So, of course, later after we make
it actually comes out on Thursday.
Yes,
it's just crazy in terms of how our data is released. But anyway, that's another story.
All right. So it inched higher to 4% from November, which was an 8-month low at 3.9% in November. The number of unemployed rose by 10,300 to 604,100. And of those seeking full-time jobs, advanced 14,900 to 412,100 people. So in theory, there's 412,100 people looking for full-time work in the marketplace that haven't got it. Now, those looking for part-time jobs fell by 4,500 to 192,100. It's summer. I'm going to go off and enjoy my summer, and then I'll potentially come back and do some work later on. The overall employment grew by 56,300 to a new peak of 14.58 million. Now, that's easily topping the forecast of 15,000. So when this number did come out in January, I was like, you've won the bet.
Well, and again, this is where the debate was coming about today with regards to, is it around the fact that we do have probably what would be argued as full employment? I mean, people love to use the term NARU, which is the net aggregate underlying rate of inflation. Don't worry about that. It's more about, are we seeing a jobs market that is straining wages and wages to the upside?
Yep.
No, we've seen that the wage price index is starting to moderate and slightly come off. It is great to see this. Again, what I'd also point out, and Ben sort of said it before, we've also got the lowest level of what we call underutilization that we've basically seen since records began, which is unemployed people and underemployed people combined. Underemployment is the one to look at here. We are more and more satisfied with the job that we have. We don't feel we need to hustle as much, which is surprising considering the cost of living crisis that we keep hearing about and the inflation story. But overall, it's a relatively reasonable employment market, with the caveat being a lot of this is coming in public service rather than coming in private. And that's where productivity will become a problem. But overall, it's good.
Yep. So we picked up those 56,300. That was also off the back of 28,200 rise in November. Part-time employment also climbed 80,000 to an all-time high of 4.55 million. But full-time employment actually declined by 23,700 to 10.04 million. So let's round out that data to the participation rate and the underemployment rate. So the participation rate edged up to a reading of 67.1, returning from it to its July peaks. And it also hit the same peak in November. And the underemployment rate also ticked down by 6% from the prior 6.1%. So, and then finally, the hours worked, which is productivity. Hours worked in all jobs rose 10 million to 1.976 million hours worked during that time. So we've covered off. It's a very, very good indicator in terms of what to look at. And so that's why we always rate it just straight under the inflation data in terms of what's important in terms of driving inflation. The next thing we need to look at is So we want to take a deeper look at this, and that's why we've got the ANZ Indeed Australian Jobs Ads Index. So this also measures the number of advertised jobs. So we haven't done this chart for a while, so I wanted to bring it back in because I wanted to see basically where those trends were. So we did see in January a 0.2% month-over-month increase. That was following a 0.3% gain in the previous month, marking the second consecutive month in a row. And you can see on the chart there that obviously for a period of time last year, we had that contraction happening, and that obviously was those tightenings in the job market, which you would expect when effectively a handbrake's being applied to the economy. So these latest figures suggested the labour market remains resilient despite these elevated borrowing costs. So we've got higher cost markets still holding on there. The ANZ economist Sophia Angela in terms of said, we do not foresee a significant downturn in the labour market in 2025, and we expect a gradual lift in the unemployment rate to a peak of 4.3%. That number's important because I suspect if that stays lower than that, that's going to be harder to get the argument up for further rate cuts. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Now, according to the Indeed economist Callum Pickering, reducing hiring in education and therapy roles significantly impacted the job ads in January. Food preparation and service opportunities also saw considerable declines, even after recording seasonally adjusted trends. And so his statement was, this was offset by a surge in management and administration opportunities in early 2025. So there's jobs in the services sector. That's why there's pressure in terms of that. Overall hiring in most sectors has stabilised in recent months on an annualised basis. And this is where you bring in all of those negative numbers there. Job ads fell by 15.1%, but remained 1.3% higher than their August 2024 low and 15% above pre-pandemic levels. So you bring a lot of people in the country. We need a lot of services. It does create jobs. Immigration absolutely creates jobs. That's why I'm a fan of it over the long term. How quickly you bring them in is where you sometimes get those
it's also
demand pressures.
And what you bring them in for. I mean, in our world, my argument at the moment is that we should be bringing in as many people that can work in construction as we can.
Yeah, agreed.
If we're going to improve the housing problem, we need to bring in
tradies. Absolutely. And once we also see this big glut of infrastructure spending coming through, those tradies finally, hopefully, and we don't see governments do any more big spending programs or big build programs.
They're going to do that.
Well, I know. Well, it's jobs for the union.
Yeah.
Jobs for the unions.
Build to rent, all that kind of stuff is all part of that whole big spend scenario. I mean,
it is. All right. Now we're going to talk about the consumer. This is the other big ticket item. So if I'm going to get $250 in my back pocket now, what am I going to do with it? If I'm going to get another 2 rate cuts potentially, what am I going to do with $750 a month? So all of a sudden it now starts to play. Now, what we did see in terms of the month-on-month read was just a slight variation. So just a slight tick up, but still in the pessimistic. So you might be saying cautiously optimistic / pessimistic. It's just sitting in there. But remember, 100% anything above is optimistic and pessimistic. But I want to highlight a couple of ones in here. So in terms of financials from a year ago, we're hurting, right? Our savings rates are going down. We're still spending, but ultimately we're absolutely digging into those savings. And in terms of those people you were talking about before, that bottom quartile of people in this country who have had it really tough, ultimately they are taking on a bit of credit and a bit of personal debt, and that's not great. So from that point of view, we definitely want to help them out as much as we can. Family finances next 12 months, that's actually looking okay. So
that's the one that's interesting. So that's the one that I kept highlighting, that we've already changed our expectation of what the next 12 months will be. And we saw that pop into optimistic territory in October.
Well, I think if you build, there's a correlation, right? There's an absolute correlation between that and the unemployment expectations. Yep. You look at how positive we think about our job security. Our job security is really high, and ultimately that's then improving our financial position. So that has been one of the other sticky points in terms of we've still been spending, and so it's taken longer for us to actually get to this point of this rate cut today.
Yep.
But those two correlate nicely. The interesting ones is always the one I want to look at, right? Which is the time to buy a dwelling. That fell further. Now that's a story of affordability. So I expect that one will inch up into a more positive read in the next couple of months?
It's also interesting when you break that down city by city.
Yes.
So,
well, that goes to the economic activity.
Correct. So if you look at Sydney and Melbourne, in October, November, the charts or all of the sort of numbers said that we actually corrected. If you look at the time to buy a dwelling in Sydney and Melbourne, for the first time in about 12 months, both of them popped to optimism.
Well, we're seeing that. I mean, I can tell you in terms of our work out in the field with our buyers, the number of people that open for inspections.
Yeah, the amount of calls that are coming through.
Yeah,
like, just the inquiries are on the up.
And Bryce and I will do a full market update on the property side in next Thursday, actually. So it's really important to understand it. Because here's the other thing, right? This is the one about sentiment. Everyone thinks the property prices just keep going higher. That reading there is just crazy. But it's again, okay, interest rates are going to go down, so property prices are going to go higher. So this is about, timing the market and sort of the opportunities you've got in different markets. So we'll get into that with Bryce Thursday week. We're recording this obviously on Tuesday. So there you go. And then interest rate expectations, you can see there that we're going back into pessimistic area. You'd naturally think that because ultimately now it's like, okay, I'm not really sure where it's going to go to from here, but we've got at least one valve released in terms of getting to that particular point. All right, so let's move into our next data point. This is, again, looking at the consumer. This is the retail sales story. We saw retail sales in Australia fell by 0.1 month on month in December, marking the first decline in 9 months through a drop. Was milder than forecast. We're thinking about a 0.7 drop. Now, remember, there was an overlap in terms of where Black Friday finished in November. It sort of rolled into December. So that's probably where you'll see that sort of irregularity in terms of only a small decline. Several retail sectors experienced contractions. They included clothing, footwear, personal accessories. Oh, just jumped ahead for me. That was interesting.
Scroll wheels.
A scroll wheel, the great scroll wheel. On the other hand, retail activity in some categories slowed growth, such as housing, good retailing, 1.6%, department stores, 0.4%, and food retailing. So that, again, I suspect that it's going to hold retail sales. I think there will be a little bit of activity in here because job security is still pretty reasonable. Do you have a view on that?
Well, no doubt, as you just pointed out, we've now got $250 in our back pocket.
Yes. So
the retail sector is the one that's been screaming out the most for some form of release from. But as I've highlighted, and I'll say it again, do what I do, not what I say is the comment I make at the moment, which is that we're saying this, but the actions actually shows that we're still spending.
Yeah.
And so this is that hard.
Can we put this one in the offset, everyone, and maybe pay off a bit of debt? I think that's where you want to be.
Yeah,
that will be. Or if you're saving up, put it into savings, guys. If you've been able to work out how to save and not have it to draw in on this money, put it in your savings account, crew. That's offset account for those people with a mortgage, I should say. All right, now we're going to obviously take a look at the business conditions and confidence. So we've got the NAB survey here, National Australia Bank, and this will sort of close out, finishing off on the Australian market. We know there's more data to look at. There's housing data and a few other things. We're going to leave that for later because we want to get into the Trump story. That's a massive story globally. And has ramifications everywhere, including here in Australia. So we saw the NAB Business Confidence Index jump by +4 in January from a -2 in December, marking the first positive reading since October. I suspect that, again, is off the back of what we saw in terms of the inflation story, and, it's starting to head in the right direction again. So we saw that pop. In terms of the business conditions, however, and this is why this would have come into play in their decisioning today. And business conditions saw an easing from +6 to down to only +3, right? So it's important to know that. And now that fell below the long-term average, which is a +7. And this is how we break it down. So we look at sales. It was 6 versus 10. So that's come off. Profitability has gone into negative territory, -2 versus +4. So
which is normal during that period.
Correct.
Discounting periods are through the roof.
They are, but also businesses are now saying that we're going to take it on the profit line through those discounting because
cash flow is king.
And we've got to try and look at it. Where are our other costs? So that would also be playing out there. Employment, I should say, edged higher, a 5 versus a 4. So my cost for my wages went up. Okay, in terms of our conditions, mixed amongst industries. So mining, retail, finance shrank, whilst wholesale, transport and manufacturing grew. Forward orders slowed slightly, so negative 0.3 versus negative 0.2, amid falls in capacity utilization, productivity, which was 82.0 versus 82.7, and CapEx, which was 4 versus 11. So whilst business confidence is there, the businesses aren't spending like they potentially used to. So we're hoping that this confidence boost will come around and that will kickstart the economy. So less of our taxpayer money pumping up the economy and more of hopefully business and private investment doing that pumping up as well. Purchase costs grew, a growth rise of 1.1% in quarterly equivalent terms, and labour costs edged up to 1.8%. So then we look at then the price. The product price growth stayed at 0.8 of 1%, and retail prices gained marginally to 0.09. And the chief economist from NAB, Alan Oster, great guy, summed up by saying that while demand remained resilient, we saw growth in the economy likely remains soft. So let's see what this little cash rate adjustment will do for that. So there you go. That's a sort of bit of a wrap in terms of what we saw there. Now, the pivot. We're going to be talking big on the US economy.
Buckle up.
Buckle up. This is big, right? We are talking about Donald Trump's experiment. It's an economic experiment. That's
the term. It's an experiment. I mean, it's one way to put it because, I mean, there has been over millennia examples of players trying this in terms of what he wants to do, which is, we're going to go through it in detail, but basically it is nationalism on a very, very high level economic scale.
But this time it's different.
Yeah, it's always different.
Okay, the US economy expanded at an annualized rate of 2.3% in Q4, the slowest growth in 3 quarters, down from 3.1% in Q3, and forecast of 2.6%. Now, that was the advanced estimates, but it's good to get GDP numbers sooner than we get them. We're not going to get ours until March for December to make sense of that. So numbers are good. The economy is moving okay.
It's doing reasonable. I mean, the US compared to the rest of the world, I think, is the way to answer that point, Ben, which is you'd probably want to be the US over most
US players. Exceptionalism, isn't that?
Yeah.
Isn't that the sort of
and so
branding?
If you look at it, I mean, again, if you remember your Year 10 economics, consumption plus imports, exports, net, government spending, private investment. And if you look at private investment and consumption in the US, it's much better than pretty much everywhere else in the world. And that's something that we are struggling with.
Yeah. Private
investment is a real issue here. Consumption is bubbling along, but it's not booming. And the US has got the reverse of that, which is why his whole concept, his experiment is the public side that we use to basically boom ourselves, he wants to reduce.
Well, this is the point, and I'm going a little bit off script here, but if you talk about regulation and taxes, that's why we're not getting the investment here, and they get it because it's more attractive over there, right?
Yep, and it always has been. I mean, and that's what we're going to get to.
All right, so let's now have a look at the inflation numbers. So we saw annual inflation rate, and this is a big talking point. We need to spend a bit of time on this, right? So the rate rose for the 3rd consecutive month to 2.9% in December from 2.7% in November. Now, that was supposedly in line with market expectations. Now, the year-end rise is partly driven by low base effect rolling over in 2023, particularly in the energy sector. Energy costs declined much less, so negative 0.5 of 1% versus negative 3.3 in November, mainly due to gasoline, negative 3.4 versus negative 8.1, fuel oil, negative 13.1 versus negative 19.5, and natural gas, 4.9% versus 1.8.
So that was the Biden's administration sort of jump-ins at that point of the
Correct.
cycle.
And that is base effect, and that is something that most people sort of don't quite grasp, but it basically means that if you're moving one value out, you get a base impact. And that's why hence they're not so worried about that last increase because of that base effect. But we did see inflation accelerate for food, 2.5% versus 2.4, transportation, 7.3% versus 7.1, and prices fell for new vehicles, negative 0.4 of 1% versus negative 0.7. On the other hand, inflation slowed for shelter, 4.6%, the lowest since January of 2022 versus 4.7%, and prices continue to decline for used cars and trucks. They've been declining for a while in used cars and trucks over there. Negative 3.3 versus negative 3.4. So Tell us about this story, Evan.
So is it any coincidence that the lowest point on that chart is in September at 2.4%? Was also the corresponding month that the US Federal Reserve, for the first time, also for it in 4 years, cut rates. Now, not only did it cut rates, it went hard. It went 0.5% in September, and we have seen that tick up. Now, Ben has pointed out why. There has been reasoning to suggest that, yes, inflation was going to pop up because you get data discrepancies. But, and it needs to be put in context with the GDP figures from before, we now know that the US is starting to see signs of re-accelerating itself. And so that is why that line in the statement today is around being cautious about going forward. Because the US is showing us very clearly that cutting rates,
50 basis points,
and then
several of them,
and then 25 bips after the fact that you can see there as well. So it's a full 1%. And what you need to remember with that is that this is the dot plots. Their federal funds rate is actually still above, now after today's numbers, us, right? So their cash rate, or their equivalent cash rate, currently sits at 4.25% to 4.5%. The reason it's a band is that unlike us, which has a flat rate that then goes into the money markets, they actually control a whole plethora of rates across timeframes. Don't worry about the technicalities, but that means that their midpoint is actually sitting at 4.35 or 4.25%. Somewhere in that.
Yeah. And I think, Jerome Powell and the Fed board are basically playing a wait and see game now.
Yeah.
Because, remember, their target is 2%, not a band of 2 to 3. They want to get down to 2%.
And they never made it.
Never made it.
So this is they almost got there. They're almost sustainably back to it. Cut rates on that, as I said before, retrospective data on the expectation that would keep going. And then they've seen a bit of a bounce. Now,
I've seen in some of their new correspondence, they've dropped that target 2%, and they have to, right? Because if they're going to keep doing it, it's going to make them look silly in terms of what that looks like.
This dot plot's what matters now. It's not what happened in 2024. Next month is the next quarter, so it'll get updated. But this is the December read, and what you can see from here is that the expectation for 2025 is that the federal funds rate will get to about 3.8. Now, if you had a look at the June dot plots, it was actually sitting at about 3%. So this is the upgrade in expectations that we've now seen. And then it brings us to the Donald Trump story.
The Donald Trump story. And remembering, these are predictions by each.
So each one of those dots is a sitting member
of the board.
And where they think rates will be. So that is, each one of those dots represents a board member. So that's why it's so much clearer.
Fascinating. Because
they actually have to put out. Now, you don't know who they are, but I can tell you, if you listen to their communications, you can work it out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But this is their 18-member board telling you where they think rates will be.
Okay, good segue. Let's roll. This is big. So this is the big US economic experiment that we're seeing under the presidency of Donald Trump 2.0. So just a quick history lesson in terms of how we got here. So what we have seen really since the late 70s is a hollowing out of that middle class. So the made in America and the big industrial steels, everything there, like they had the lifestyle. They had everything. They had gainful employment. The quality of life, the standard of living was far superior than most of the other developed nations around the world, and certainly different to a lot of those socialist countries that we have around that particular time. So that has then meant that voters have been disenfranchised with the lack of action, and they feel worse off, right? So part of his big strategy was, do you feel worse off? And we're going to see it here in Australia in terms of how the Liberals are going to play their message. Do you feel worse off than what you were 4 years ago? That's going to be the angle, right?
This is despite the fact that if you actually have a look 4 years ago, you've seen a 5-time increase in output from the US. You've seen economics actually be one of the best periods they've pretty much seen, coming from a low base because it was COVID.
But to that point, it's going to the few.
Yeah,
it's going to the select few and the mega rich and so forth. So that's the angle
and
that he took.
It's not in Middle America.
Correct. It's not in the Rust Belt.
It's
not
in
anywhere through
services. It's in technology. It's in new digital world US, not in this.
So what was his pitch in terms of that? So they're obviously feeling that, this government or any other government can't solve their problems. They want not the political elite, they want a showman, a businessman who can come in and effectively try and execute on
They want
a
to
change.
They want to prep.
Of course they do.
And that's the term. I mean,
they want a populist politician who can come in and potentially.
And there's a lot of promise.
Yep, there's a lot of promise. So what is it? How did he win the popular vote and the collegial vote in terms of to form government? These were the sort of big pillars that he went on, right? So he promised to bring back industry and jobs to the US, number one. He then also said you're going to stop the immigration, right? So all of these millions of people coming across the borders, and he frames it up with murderers and rapists and all of these stuff to just get the narrative.
Or that they're eating cats and dogs.
Yeah, eating cat. Like all of this is just the narrative to try and connect with the common man in terms of and it works, unfortunately, in terms of this. Then there's the tax cuts. So what we've got is the personal tax cuts. So he did introduce in 2018 a 37% top tax rate. And now he wants to make that long-term law. It was only in for a short period of time, so he's trying to do that. They also want to remove any tax on tips and also social services income that people potentially earn. And the kicker for business is he wants a 21% tax rate to drop down to 15%. Remembering in Australia it's 30%, and 25% of your business, I think, turns over less than 10 million a month.
Yeah.
A year.
Yeah.
A year. So again, why wouldn't I invest? Why wouldn't I go and build in America is his argument there in terms of if I want to produce and sell goods to the biggest consumer market in the world, why not do it in our backyard rather than bringing it via ship and then selling it cheaply on their shores? And then obviously the last one here is to cut the US debt spending, the regulatory red tape and the government waste. And obviously that's the Department of Government Efficiency, or commonly referred to as DOGE, which is being led by Elon Musk in terms of trying to look at that waste. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to just unpack those in a little bit more detail to try and give you the context in terms of what experiment he's trying to pull off. Because at the end of the day, it is really important to understand how this works in a globalized economy versus an economy that Donald Trump is trying to make great again in terms of that impact. So step number one, we talked about promises to bring back industry and jobs to the US. So how he plans to do that is he wants to introduce tariffs on imported goods. Now, the context here is this. The US send a truckload of goods and services offshore, around 3.119 trillion, with a T. That's 1,000 billion for every trillion. And then they import around 3.3 trillion. Now that constitutes, both of those, just in the context of just how big the US economy is about 11% for imports and 11% for exports. Okay, so that's roughly the size of the opportunity here. But when you think about that in trillions, that's millions of jobs potentially.
Yep.
Right. It is millions of jobs that he's wanting to get onshore. So the goal here is he wants to force businesses to produce goods in the US or make imported goods more expensive compared to locally made goods. And if that happens, and he says, come and set your factories up over here, there'll be more investment and there'll be more jobs on the ground in the US, number one. Second part of that is tariffs will generate some of that government revenue, because we're going to be talking about the giveaways, which is the tax cuts, which is government revenue that he's not going to get. So
his argument is it's a net sum game, but he wants the net gain to be for the domestic.
Correct.
The net loser to be the foreign.
Offshore. Exactly right. So what is his challenges? What are the impacts here in terms of, well, the reality is if you introduce tariffs, they automatically make goods more expensive. So like anything we talk about the input cost and the final produced price. Well, we've got lots of costs, energy costs, we've got labor costs, we've got all of those types of things. But at the end of the day, when you sell it, I'm just going to put a sales tax on the end of that. And so ultimately the consumer pays that price. Now that sales tax, which goes on the end, is the tariff that's being paid. Now that's inflationary when we judge that across the basket of goods.
I also need to point out, the capitalist, players that are out there always go back to one person, and that's Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman's one line about tariffs, I think, is the absolute killer blow, which is that tariffs are not a tax on the sovereign, they are a tax on the consumer. And so you are talking about the pin-up of capitalism
Yep.
in Milton Friedman has already basically pointed out very clearly that the goods aren't taxed until they hit the US. So that extra, as Ben pointed out, that extra sales tax only happens to US consumers. It doesn't actually happen to the good until it gets there. And what we saw in Trump 1.0, China's the great example. They found other markets. And not only did they find other markets, they made it incredibly cheap for other markets to offset the loss of their goods appearing more expensive because a tariff is on top of it.
Yeah, and they're trying to argue that they'll get the supplier to pay that price. So it's not technically a sales tax at the end of that journey, but it
comes in an input cost.
It's going to have to come on the end product price. Or I've got to go back and find productivity. I've got to find other savings or ways to make my goods competitive. So that's challenge number one. It's inflation. That inflation leads to obviously higher cost of debt. So we've been learning obviously about when inflation is high, the brakes come on, the cost of money goes higher. So they put higher cost on debt, and that ultimately means that the economy slows down. So that is actually a job killer, because that investment doesn't come in, that whole momentum, that economic flywheel doesn't occur as part of that. So what we then see is retaliatory responses. Oh, okay, you want to put a tariff on aluminium and steel? We're going to do the same thing in terms of anything that you import on those same goods coming into us. So it's net doesn't really make any valuable difference in terms of what it looks like. But again, the idea is to ultimately get the businesses to work out that they need to build the factories in America and build the goods in America and bring the raw materials in, and that's the end game that he's trying for.
And the other thing that isn't sort of clearly outlined there is that you therefore, if you are going to make a new manufacturing hub in the US, you're doing that with US manufacturing rates, US cost rates, US employment rates that also feed back into this dilemma. Is that making it at home is great, except that you are uncompetitive on a global scale. Let's bring it back to an Australian perspective. Future made in Australia, that is the same principle in terms of what this argument is, which is if we make it, we nationalise our ability to therefore make solar panels, we can therefore, insulate ourselves from global supply shocks, et cetera, except we can't do it at a rate or at a cost that is competitive to China.
And that is the labour cost as a component of the input costs. If I can, whether it's clothing, textiles, whatever, I'll just move different countries because the machinery is doing most of the work, and then the human labour. But if I can get that human labour at $2 an hour versus $8 an hour, I will go and find that labour opportunity,
productivity,
and that obviously increases my margin. So it doesn't necessarily guarantee that even if those goods were made in the US, it definitely means that consumers probably going to pay more because of those input costs are going to be higher. But you can also then argue with, well, if the importer still has the 20% tariff, they still might be able to make it commercially viable, even if they're only still making a 20% margin as opposed to a 30% margin.
Because the final point to this first part of Trump's agenda is time. It takes years to make these manufacturing places. He could actually be out of the White House by the time these players come in, with an administration that may or probably would, if they switched over back to a Democrat sort of scenario, basically reverse almost all of what he puts into play.
Back to free market.
Over the next 4 years.
Back to the World Trade Organization doing that. Okay, let's go to number 2. This one was the illegal immigrants, and crossing the border. So, obviously that's been a big problem for them. They believe around 15 million people have come over the borders illegally, and so that is the challenge that they've got. Now, in terms of how they believe they can solve that problem, well, you can see they whacked a 25% tariff on Canada and on the Mexican borders, and both governments planned that they said they'll increase, and they got a 1-month exemption in terms of stopping that particular thing.
Sort of Damocles is still very much there over their heads with regards to, it's his threat.
Now, it's fair and reasonable, right? I mean, in terms of we want people to do it the right way, get into their countries in the right manner. So what it will mean is that he wants to deport foreign illegal immigrants that have arrived and reduced the overall number of illegal immigrants coming into the US. In addition to that, there's going to be less labour supply, which obviously means more jobs for US citizens. So if that cheaper labour goes, then ultimately the businesses need to find more productivity, but they need to hire American citizens. So that's all well and good. Makes a lot of sense. The challenge of all of these things is always that, right? In terms of they're very huge borders. It's very expensive to stop these illegal immigrants.
You've got to look at it. Canada is the second largest country area-wise on the planet, and the US is third.
Yeah, and look at the
look at the border that it touches,
and there's also a lot of ocean.
Yeah.
So if instead of just coming via land, I'll just come via the boat or water. In terms of getting it.
You go to the southern border. Mexico's, I think, it's the 15th largest country. The borders are huge. And
the other part to that is obviously if you take that supply of labour out, where they're willing to work for a cheaper rate, or work off the books, then ultimately those costs are going to also flow on. So it's very much inflationary. In terms of US wages.
And this was my big point last year, you already put it out when you did the inflation numbers. The one to watch there, food inflation is already on the up. The most likely labour supply problem will be agriculture for the US going forward, because the rates that we're being paid to fruit pickers, to vegetable croppers, those kinds of plays is probably at minimum wage, if not below. The US works on a tip system so they can get through it much easier as well. All of a sudden, they're gone. And they therefore then have to go to an American citizen with American expectations for a wage. You're already putting an incredible inflation upside, let alone the fact that, as Ben just said,
minimum would be double.
You are talking about lowering the amount of labour supply. Simple economics. Lower supply, still the same demand.
Tight labour market.
You're pushing prices up. So that's wage price increase. This is why it fascinates me.
It's an experiment. I mean,
it's not even an experiment. It's literally just going, I'm going to reinvent economics.
Maybe. Oh, look, this is why I think it is fascinating. I can't wait to see how it plays out. Tax cuts. Okay, so how do I also buy votes?
Yeah.
This is the one that always buys the votes in terms of when I'm voting for someone, what's in it for me? What sort of money are they going to throw at me? And that's populist politics 101, right, in terms of that. So the personal tax rate is obviously going down. Now, I'm a big fan of less government, less taxes, and basically an open free market normally generates all of the quality and living standards that we need. That's a story for another day. But I do also think here in terms of the business decision in terms of domestic. So if you produce your goods domestically, so in other words, let's say Volvo decides to start building cars in the US instead of building them in Germany, or what's the other country that they build in next to Germany? I can't think of it. No, I've lost it. I'll keep moving. So ultimately you're saying, well, build them here. There's no tariffs. And ultimately the profits that you make here get to stay here. We'll only tax them at 15 cents in the dollar. Like Belgium, that was the one I was looking for. Okay, knew it would come to me eventually. So that's what they're trying to do here. Now, so how do they do that? Executive orders, getting it through Congress. That in itself, Congress want the money. Remember, all the people in Congress are trying to do something for their states and the people that they look after. So their big claim to fame is, I got this for you, I got this for you, I got this government money to build this institution or whatever. So everyone's clamoring for the revenue dollars that are coming into government, or the debt to basically build all of these promises that these politicians make. There's a problem with it, right? So as a congressman, I'm trying to protect my job. So I'm trying to get as much money out of government as possible. I don't really care about government debt. So this is going to be a problem in terms of getting that through a Congress in that respect. So what are the goals though? The personal one is definitely buy votes, keep the voters on side, and obviously take home more of their pay. And then the business side of it is increase business investment. So more businesses setting up in the US to support the market and obviously support jobs. That's what I said about getting it through Congress in terms of paying for it, lost revenue, running government services.
You already see that. I mean, the forward estimates on how much money will be raised through tariffs is extraordinary in terms of what they think will be. It's like they expect not only nothing to change, but actually to see an increase in the amount of revenue coming in from tariffs because more goods are going to come into the US. It already is a game that is making a loss because the forecasts are already wrong and you are just going to accelerate the US debt position.
Well, so let's talk to those forecasts before we move on. So we saw there that just the nature of the personal tax cuts, that's going to cost the US government in terms of revenue about $4.8 trillion over 10 years. The cuts in terms of the tips, so making tips tax-free and social security payments, that's another $1.5 trillion. And then you've got the business tax cuts, and that's a bit hard to work out because how much foreign investment are you going to bring in? How much money are you going to bring in? But they're estimating that to be between 4.2 trillion and $11.2 trillion. So that is an enormous amount of lost revenue.
Back of the envelope, you're talking about nearing to $20 trillion.
20,000 billion
in tax cuts.
In tax cuts. So what is the counterbalance to that? Because remembering, he knows that he can't do that. And he actually is, likes to run the government off lower debt. So that goes into point number 4, or pillar number 4, in terms of what he's come in to try and do. So we can see here, this is about cutting the US debt, spending, regulation, and obviously government waste. So how he's going to do that? Through the executive orders that he's doing and trying to get them into Congress. Now, the challenge here, and remembering here that as of November of 2024, US debt is $36 trillion. Now, no other country in the world the only reason why they can have that sort of level of debt is they're the default currency of the globe.
Yep.
They are the financial market that runs the full globe. There's no other country that can sit here and run debt levels like they do. Everything's set against the US dollar.
Yeah, and they also have an economy that can actually sustain it. Yeah. This is the other thing. They do have an economy that is 50% larger than the second largest economy in the world, which is China. And so that's why they know they can get away with this. I mean, as you said before we went on air, for every dollar spent, 20 cents is spent in the States.
In the US.
So
globally, that's incredible.
It's just a staggering size and why they can do this, and are probably the only nation that can do this. We just would not have the fiscal, monetary, overall personal size to run even what would be an equivalent scenario.
We're 1.3% of the global economy, for everyone to understand. We're just sitting down in the southern hemisphere doing our own little thing.
But 0.5% of the total global population as well. There you
go. So the big issue here is if we work on the current settings, that if nothing changes, there's going to be another $23.9 trillion of debt. And then debt to GDP will be 118% by 2035. So that is in itself a problem. And like the debts that we've got here in Australia, and also even the Victorian debt that I go on about and bang on about in the Victorian government, the amount of money that we have to raise in terms of taxes just to pay the interest bill is extraordinary. So you do not want to be doing that. You want basically debt to be around 3% of GDP, not 118% of GDP. So the Doge program is trying to save $1 trillion, okay? So, they're looking for $1 trillion in savings, and ultimately off the current $1.9 trillion deficit. So the government isn't running surpluses either. They're still running deficits. Mm-hmm. So that means that ultimately the debt is continuing to rise further and further. And so with 15% cut of federal government spending, that's the $1 trillion that they believe that they can save. Now, Trump's ruled out touching Medicare or social services.
Which is interesting because there's a lot in the Republican Party that really would love them to touch Medicare in particular.
But good on him in terms of thinking about the voters who voted him in. They are some of the more lower socio-economic areas.
And rely heavily on those two things.
Heavily on those two things. And one area obviously is the defence budget. We've talked about the bloated military industrial complex. They have an enormous amount of pull inside government to get the tens of billions of dollars that they get and the hundreds of billions that they got to spend in terms of their military and defence forces. So that is interesting. So the goal is to help reduce US debt by reducing spending, to remove regulation to increase productivity and competitiveness, and these new tariffs revenue that will come in off the back of that. The challenge, as we just talked about again, is another one of Congress in terms of getting that. And there's also pre-existing laws. So around 50% of the government budget is actually already enshrined in law. So he has to get those laws changed through Congress. And remember, those congressmen and women, they want money. They want money so they can deliver on their promises that got them into their seats in Congress. 50 states, it's hard work in terms of being able to get consensus and getting those things changed in 4-year term that he's got.
Yep.
Okay, cost of pre-existing debt, we've talked about that. The risk is high, increased repayments via higher inflation. So if higher inflation occurs, all of that debt that you've got to pay back is going to be paid at a high interest bill cost. So Trump needs to make sure that inflation remains low and interest rates remain low, but that's going to be difficult under his policy settings. We finally then, obviously there's also the classic sabotage and the unions who will stop all of this sort of stuff from happening. The number of lawsuits that have already been issued based on these executive orders, it's going to clog up in the legal system for a while. So he doesn't have
and
a lot of time.
The DOJ is one of the big areas that both himself and Elon Musk is targeting with their $1 trillion of cuts. So not only are you going to have more lawsuits going through, you're going to have less people to hear it.
So growing the US economy finally with obviously these higher inflation settings that we predict will eventually materialize. So let's say key takeaways from this experiment is he's got a clear agenda and this is what he wants to execute. He wants to see all roads lead to the US, to obviously look for more revenue in terms of the citizens, getting jobs in there, getting non-US goods being sold in America and make it made in America. He wants to reduce public spending and waste. He wants to invest back in the America and in terms of all goods being made, not imported. And he wants a lot, right? So all of a sudden, it really is about the economic consequences, both to the US and obviously to the rest of the world, because he's, in a way, picking a bit of a fight, even though he's still exporting around $3.1 trillion worth of goods. So that is ultimately what the thing. So this Trump 2.0 experiment is just beginning, and we're going to have to wait and see how it's going to play out.
Yeah, I think the way to finalise the whole thing is the impact from an Australian-centric point of view is pretty clear. We've seen what happened in Trump 1.0. It does have less checks and balances this time around. It doesn't have as many people that will pull him up on some of his ideas. You have a scenario also where the US consumer is the unknown story here.
Yeah.
When they start feeling the pinch and start feeling that the hurt of pricing changes, because this, all of what we've just discussed, that it's just inflationary. There is no other argument for it. What they do and the midterms will be the answer. So it's not when do we play this out? You're going to see this over the next 2 years, and it's probably why he's moving so quickly.
He is moving at lightning speed because of exactly that reason.
So 2027 is going to be massive because history shows midterms, every administration, doesn't matter whether you like them or don't, always experiences a turn for good reason because you now understand where they sit.
Yeah.
So he's got 2 years, not 4. He's got 2 years to do this because it's probable that he will lose one of the houses, whether it's the Senate or whether it's the House itself.
Mm-hmm.
And he therefore won't have the ability to really drive this agenda once he loses that scenario, because then he has to fight even harder to get legislation done. And that's why it's an experiment. And it's the only fair
word
term.
for it. I can't wait to see how it plays. Now, there is obviously this belief that US exceptionalism is real. We know that they're leading the AI. We know the productivity. We know all of those things are also true. It is a fascinating country, both for good and bad reasons.
Yep.
All right. We promise you a massive show. We are getting to the last 2 stages of it. We want to just do the China story and the Eurozone stories quickly to basically move you into getting an understanding and context in terms of what's happening. So the GDP numbers out of China, we saw they came in seasonally adjusted at 1.6% in Q4, and that was accelerating on an upwardly revised 1.3% in Q3, and it's marking the strongest quarterly increase since Q1 of 2023, and the Chinese government stimulus has flown through to the economy. That's really what we're seeing here. So this is very similar. You pump some money into the economy, it starts to turn over that. Now, it's also indicated that the 10th consecutive quarter of advancement post their COVID period, and we can see it back here in terms of the 0.8 that they had through that COVID period. Now, obviously, China's biggest challenge remains the new developing trade war that we see happening with the US. We'll get to that in our summary. I'll move through in terms of their annual inflation story. They've really warded off the risk of disinflation. That was their biggest problem.
And moving into deflation, let's be honest.
Yeah. So we see here that, inflation climbed by 0.5 of 1% in January. And that's from 0.1 of 1% in December, surpassing market expectations of a 0.4 of 1% increase. This marked the highest level since August of 2024, driven by seasonal effects from the Lunar New Year and the end of the month. The latest result also reflected the impact of recent government stimulus measures and the central bank's accommodative monetary policy to support the economy. The government push to forward off inflation in China seems to be working.
They were probably dragged kicking and screaming to this. There was big signs at the end of last year that Xi Jinping finally was like, okay, we can't keep going down this path. We spoke about that when they did move in October. It's the same thing. And what's going on here with the PBOC is a final sign that they can't keep going the way they're going.
Yeah, so what we've seen here at the moment is the rates are kept on hold. So we still see that the 5-year LPR rate, which serves as a reference to property investment mortgage, remained at 3.6%. And so that's what we're seeing. And then we've also seen the benchmark rate, which is the one we're seeing here in front, which is the home loans, was maintained at 3.1%. So that's basically where we see the China story. So in terms of wrapping up China, again, they've got to turn domestically. That's what they've been trying to stimulate. They understand that, they need to do some more heavy lifting in terms of getting their local economy firing, because they've got this trade war that's going to come up. And that ultimately means that, the goods that they're producing and they export. And here's some data for context for you, that China is the US's third biggest buyer of US exports. So you're talking about, okay, you're picking a fight with the country that buys the third most goods from you, compared to, and Canada is number one, Mexico is number two. So he's picking these big fights.
In his first week.
Yeah. And you're seeing here at one point, $143.5 billion they buy annually of US exports. So that is quite interesting. And the top 4 exports, what you need to know is agriculture, produce, technology, machinery, transport, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals. Now, the US imported, and this is where Donald Trump's argument is, they imported $462 billion. So 143 billion versus 462 billion of goods. And the top 5 things that the US buy are pretty much turning apples into apple pie: electronics, machinery, furniture and bedding, clothing and sporting equipment, and clothing and apparel.
Yeah.
So,
and you'll point out, so electronics, the majority of them are things like phones. And that's where he's pointing himself straight at somebody like Apple. Stop making Apple phones in China. Come back and make them.
Come and make them in Oz. Come and make them in the US, not Oz. Okay, let's wrap up now with the Eurozone and what we saw here in the Eurozone. There was a bit of movement, so it's important to understand what we saw in terms of their economic activity. GDP was flat in Q4. In terms of the two largest economies saw contraction. So Germany GDP shrunk by surprisingly 0.2%, and France's also declined by 0.1%. Italy stagnated for the second consecutive quarter. Ireland's GDP fell by 1.3%. Austria's economy also flatlined. On the other hand, the robust results came out of Spain, 0.8%, Portugal 1.5%, Lithuania 0.9%, Belgium 0.2%, Estonia 0.1%. Very small numbers in the grand scheme of things.
Small nations, yes. Overall.
Year on year, the Euro area GDP grew by 0.9%. Let's keep moving in terms of the annual rate of inflation. So we can see there, remember, their target is for a 2%. So what we're seeing, annual inflation in Euro area edged up 2.5% in January from a reading of 2.7 in December, slightly above market expectations of 2.4. This was the highest inflation rate since July of 2024, driven primarily by a sharp acceleration in energy costs, 1.8% versus 0.1 in December. Meanwhile, inflation for non-energy industrial goods remained steady at 0.5%, whilst price increases slowed for both services, 3.9 versus 4, food, alcohol and tobacco, 2.3 versus 2.6. The core inflation rate, which excludes, as we know, the volatile items, was unchanged to 2.7 for the 5th consecutive month, slightly above market forecasts of 2.6, but still in its lowest area since early 2022. That obviously leads into the monetary policy story. And so what did we see in terms of monetary policy? We saw that the ECB lowered the key rate interest rate by 25 basis points as expected, reducing the deposit facility rate to 2.75 and the main refinancing rate to 2.9, and the marginal lending rate to 3.15. This move reflects the ECB's updated inflation outlook, with price pressures easing in line with their projections. I didn't quite see that in the inflation line, but anyway.
So the Eurozone at the moment is fascinating because I think this is where we need to finish. You alluded to it before. If you're a Germany, right now you are facing some of the biggest pressures you've possibly seen in modern times. Same with France. So you have Trump's tariffs. If you're Volkswagen or if you're Daimler or if you're in some form of chemical engineering, you're really worried about this. If you're France and you're in aerospace and aeronautical engineering, Airbus, for example, you're also really worried about what's going on, and that's where the contraction. We then also have a complete seizing up of French politics. The moment they are basically stranded until July when they can do the next round of elections, nothing's going on. Olaf Scholz in Germany, he's also on the nose. Incumbency sucks right now. You are in real trouble. So that's 2 points. The tariffs are going to hit Europe probably more than any other part. I'd even argue over China, considering that it's automobiles and high-end manufacturing. That's what Germany, France, and Italy do. That's what they are.
Look, this nationalist politics that's going on,
and it's just going to get worse,
is dangerous because, again, these countries and these political parties are promising false promises. And once people work out that there's no surprises in the box and the presence that these politicians are basically promising, that's when the whole thing falls on itself.
And let's not underestimate what has happened when we are recording this, which is in the midweek of February. The talk around the Ukraine-Russian war scenario with, the possibility that the US is dealing Europe and actually the Ukrainians out of some form of peace deal is going to get louder. You are possibly making a geopolitical political call over the Atlantic because already you've seen the UK stand up and say, well, actually, we'll put troops in Ukraine.
Peacekeeping troops, but still troops on the ground.
This is where we are now entering in terms of that space. Now, I do want to point out, from a US perspective, why would getting peace with Russia matter so much? Oil, right? If you take Ukraine off the table, the oil upside pressure that we've had for the last 3 years will dissipate real quick. And so,
and the rare earths. So he doesn't care who actually runs the country. He wants the rare earths out of Ukraine and obviously Greenland as part of their AI strategy and their tech strategy. So he's playing a big game.
Big battles to come.
Big battles. All right, so let's wrap it up, everyone. Let's bring it home. Looking ahead, we promised you at the start that we wanted to sort of give you some indications in terms of what's going to be happening. The biggest show in town is Trump. You don't know what he's going to say. He's an unknown quantity. What he says and what he does are going to be two different things. So we need to always take that into context in terms of as we know his agenda. We understand exactly what he's trying to do. He wants to make America great again. That's his simple philosophy. In terms of the Australian economy, we had our rate cut today. We've got a federal election, which will probably, I'm predicting, will be called off the back of that cut. If we didn't get a cut today, I would have thought they would have pushed it out a little bit more. But I suspect,
therefore, April is going to be when we're all off to the polls.
Correct. So we will be off to the polls now. It's an interesting time, right? We've got Easter and rolls into Anzac Day and everything like that.
WA's got an election in there.
Yes, they've got something in March, I think they're March. So that's interesting. In terms of productivity, we haven't really spoken much about it, but I want to keep bringing it back to this, right? If we're going to get these wage increases, we've obviously got to get movement in terms of productivity, and we haven't seen that. And so the governor will continue to keep banging her hand on the table about getting higher productivity if we're going to continue to keep getting inflation under control. Because one way to kill off inflation is to be more productive in your input costs and make a better, higher production out of the cost base in terms of what you're getting. So that is one area that will continue to be a thorn in our side generally in terms of how this country runs. In terms of, we will hopefully see less government spending and hopefully more private investment spending. But to do that, we need reforms. We need government to get out of the way. We need businesses and open markets to basically allow that to happen. Now, I also promise you that Thursday week, Bryce and I will be wearing our property hats and we'll be talking about predictions across the property market, including recapping what we talked about in 2024. So it really is going to be an interesting time. So we did promise you our predictions. Next rate cut is
July at best.
July. Okay, that gives me a little window. I am going to, because I was happy to take May, so I will take May. I don't think it's going to come in April, but I'm going to take May. Or it's either they're going to pull. We both could be wrong. Whatever we do, whoever wins, we'll put the money into charity. We might even put it into Bryce's special event that he's doing in terms of celebrating his
Very
50th.
good.
I think that's why we don't need each other. We don't need to take each other's money. So thank you everyone for hanging around. Remember, knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it. Obviously, the information we provided today is general in nature. Don't take any of this as investment advice. And we hope you have a great time. And we will see you in April.
Yep, on, of all things, April Fool's Day. April 1st is the next rate decision.
2 fools for April Fool's Day.
Thanks, all.
Take care, everyone. Bye for now.